Yeah, I'm from Yungarundi First Nations Centre. I'm the research coordinator at Flinders Uni, and this is actually a paper that was developed, a report by Professor Daryl Rigney and myself. Daryl's the Dean of Indigenous Strategy Engagement at Flinders Uni. He's at a Senate meeting today, so he can't be here to present, but he'd probably be the lead presenter in this presentation if he was here. I think it's worth mentioning that he's both Indigenous, he's Ngarrindjeri, he's a native title holder for the First Peoples native title claim, and he's a native title claimant on the lower claim. So the area we're talking about in the Murray-Darling Basin region in South Australia, one of the authors is both a professor, he's Indigenous, he holds native title for part of that area, and he's a claimant on the other. The claim that was called First Peoples, his father actually was the original chair of the committee that put it in. So we're presenting I guess a research project that has both an outsider like myself who's worked with the communities for a long time and actually a member of the community who's both a professor, an academic and a researcher. So it's, I guess, a different sort of methodology. The front of our presentation, actually seen from the Lower Murray area, has 4 pelicans there, and we have on the side there an exhibition panel which the Ngarrindjeri people put together, which actually sets the ground for our presentation, which is sort of remembering that the land was taken from Aboriginal people, there were no treaties, and that what happened afterwards wasn't good, that children were stolen and a range of other issues happened. And the document that you see there is actually the letters patent, which is the original founding document of South Australia that promised that no lands and waters would be alienated from Aboriginal people, basically without bargains and treaties. So for the Indigenous leadership people in the Murray-Darling Basin region, those fundamental questions about ownership of issues like water are still very open and part of the conversation. And the pelicans that are there in the background, from Daryl's perspective, and I certainly share a lot of these understandings, they represent the ancestors and the leaders who've recently passed in the community. And what you see in the background is not actually water and environment, but it's actually body, spirit and people, and it has different sets of meanings. So it's useful to put that into context. I'd like to pay respects to the Kaurna ancestors, elders, leaders and young people and recognise their ownership of these lands and waters, and recognise Ngarrindjeri ancestors, elders and leaders, and just warn people that this presentation contains some people who have recently passed away. There's a recognition of one of the partner organisations that worked with us on this project, the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority. Thank the Gaudiya Institute for giving us the opportunity to be involved in the research and the presentation. And Duna is in there as a partner in Flinders Uni. There's also a little dedication to Ngarrindjeri people that elders put together in a founding document that Ngarrindjeri put together a couple of years ago called the Sea Country Plan, which again reminds people that the ancestors, the spirits of people are in those lands and waters, and they're part of them. The project that we worked on, this is basically an account of the report. It's part of a broader project which is looking at an assessment of research requirements to support effective provision of environmental water allocation in South Australia's Murray-Darling Basin region. Indigenous people's interest in water are often closely allied with what's seen as environmental water. And what we were setting out to do was actually look at an engagement framework for engaging with Indigenous people around these issues to do with environmental water allocation management and research. The area we're talking about is the Murray-Darling region in South Australia, includes Ngarrindjeri lands and other groups. The work we did was focused mostly on the region from Morgan down to the Lower Lakes area. The First Peoples group didn't engage strongly in the work we did, and so that the model that we're actually advocating is a model that's been developed for the lower part of that region. But it's a model that Daryl, as a professor and a native title holder for the upper part of the region, is very strongly an advocate for as an effective way of engaging with Indigenous people around these issues. The language there is Kung Ngarrindjeri Yanan, and I think it's really critical to recognise, start again, my story is slightly different. What I'm telling the story is on behalf of and with Daryl Rigney is actually an engagement strategy and framework that's been Indigenous led. So it's not in a framework of engagement with Indigenous people developed by researchers and government. It's actually a framework that's been Indigenous-led in South Australia and this region, and has developed into a partnership with local councils and governments. So this is a framework that Indigenous people have developed to engage with the state around water. So it's turning the model on its head to some extent. Now the history of this is really important. If you don't come from South Australia, it's really, really important to recognise that the people I'm talking about, the Ngarrindjeri people, and the people who've engaged in this thinking, including Darryl, went through an issue called Hindmarsh Island, which was an issue that's nationally significant. Hindmarsh Island was a struggle over heritage and development, but at the heart of it, it was a struggle over water. It was about the meeting of the waters. A group of Indigenous women who had deeply held spiritual understandings of that area, and men, wanted to stop a development in that area and try to explain to the state why they wanted to stop it. And it related to the waters in that area specifically, their deeply held knowledge. As people from South Australia would know, and others, things didn't work out well. It turned into royal commissions, a rewriting of the constitution, court cases that went on forever, people's lives destroyed, researchers from this university deeply traumatised, Indigenous leaders and elders broken, split communities. Because the water was so important, that area, if you call it water, was so important. And the state and the Indigenous people didn't know how to interact on that issue. It was called cultural heritage, but it was talking about what would be effectively seen as water from a non-Indigenous perspective. So out of that experience in the 1995, 94, through that period, Ngarrindjeri actually got together with academics and others and started to rethink their engagement with the state, built out of their horrible experiences around Hindmarsh Island. In the 2000s, there was a big drought, and Ngarrindjeri leaders who'd been through Hindmarsh Island were really worried that because they had to deal with protecting their lands and waters, their body, in the face of a drought and all of the engineering solutions that were being proposed, how were they going to negotiate their way around those sorts of issues and come out of the space with their community intact in a healthy form, a better understanding of what they were trying to argue, and maybe a new way of engaging. And that's what happened out of that space. And what happened was Ngarrindjeri, instead of taking legislative pathway, invoking the Aboriginal Heritage Act, or protesting in the streets during the drought, started to work with the local community, local council and others. And there was various agreements signed, formal contract law agreements, called Listen to Ngarrindjeri People Talking. The first one was signed with the local council, Alexandriti Council, who were right in the heart of that Hindmarsh Island issue. It included an apology for racist acts and loss and theft of lands and other issues, and set a new framework of engagement which recognised Ngarrindjeri as the traditional owners of the lands and waters, and that they had interest in those lands and waters, have interest in those lands and waters, and a new relationship had to be developed from there. Those local council agreements were then turned into 2009 during the period where Murray Futures as a program was being brought into South Australia. Ngarrindjeri framed up their engagement with the Murray Futures program around the Konga-Ngarrindjeri agreement with the whole of South Australia. So what happened was that the state of South Australia actually signed a legal agreement with the Ngarrindjeri Nation as a nation group who were arguing that they were the lands and waters and that they needed to be engaged in particular ways. And this statement, the lands and waters is a living body, made by these two leaders who have all passed. They're leaders who helped to develop this engagement strategy. And this is the one that we tried to explain and describe how it's evolving at the moment in our project. And what we were basically arguing is that here in South Australia, in the Murray-Darling Basin region, there's a very unique and interesting engagement model being developed and has been developed, which needs to be looked at. Don't look to eastern states for your solutions. Look to South Australia and be aware of what's going on and recognise it's Indigenous-led. It's collaboration with state government and others. So this message about the lands and waters as a living body was at the heart of that work. Recently, the Ngarrindjeri have signed an agreement around the meeting of the waters and that Murray Mouth area, the lakes, called Speaking as Country, where the government's actually recognised that the Ngarrindjeri are speaking as country, and what might that mean for management and research in the region. And there's some resources being allocated to that. Now, talking about methodologies, this is an Indigenous ACID scholar from the US, a Chickasaw scholar, who writes about Indigenous methodologies. It's the kind of methodologies that are informing my research, but also the research that the Indigenous academics and scholars I'm working with work with. Coming out of natural resource management and sciences, you may not be able to read that methodology. I find it hard to follow acid sulfate soils kind of research sometimes myself. But I think I'm making a point actually here that internationally Indigenous people are talking to each other about these questions, are in influencing the thinking at the local level. So ideas from the North America and New Zealand are being taken on board by local Indigenous leaders and academics and turned into strategies for engagement. And this is actually quite a sophisticated take on how Indigenous knowledge and theory interacts with what's seen as critical theory and post-colonial theory, and the problems and the gaps in those sort of theoretical approaches. And what it really is saying is that the local regions like South Australia are producing new valuable ways of thinking and combinations of knowledges and theories. And that's kind of type of methodology that I'm using. Now, Ngarrindjeri in 2006 put together a management plan for the region based on the philosophies of Ngarrindjeri people, which actually had a declaration of dominion in the back. So Ngarrindjeri said, we are still a sovereign nation. We believe we haven't given that up, but we want to work in partnership and live locally in this region, and here's our vision for how to do that. And it's on the web. It was launched by Weatherall, Premier Weatherall. It's supported by Duna and others, and it's recognised as a template for engagement in the region. It sets a high bar for how to engage. It has this kind of vision for country at the front that Ngarrindjeri leaders and elders put together. It's not a particularly radical vision, but it's the kind of vision that most scientists working in the region would share a lot, and local non-Indigenous people would share the values embedded in that vision. So there's basically, I guess, Ngarrindjeri putting together a statement of values and hopes and objectives that could be taken seriously in space. Ngarrindjeri have also set up a regional authority since 2007 to look after the lands and waters and all of the people. That regional authority is the body that engages with the state through the Kunga Ngarrindjeri Yanan Agreement. Ngarrindjeri leaders meet with the Premier and sometimes and ministers on a 2 or 3 monthly basis to talk about issues to do with lands and waters and country. But I guess the key here is in terms of governance, what Ngarrindjeri has said is that if you're going to look after the people, you have to look after the lands and waters, and they all go together. You can't disconnect them from an Indigenous perspective. So if you're doing work on translocating rupiah in the Coorong, Ngarrindjeri have to be part of that project. They have to be part of translocation, doing the research, thinking about it, gain employment from it, gain educational opportunities from that project. And in doing that work, there are a whole lot of spin-offs, health-wise, culturally, economically. From a Ngarrindjeri perspective, because there's that understanding of the connection between all living things, it's not a problem to think about those connectedness in governance. So these goals talk to the sort of hope that Ngarrindjeri have in terms of the role of the regional authority. So they might say, if somebody puts a project on the table like, we want to monitor fish in the Coorong, Ngarrindjeri can ask the question, how does that support our culture? How does it support us as a First Nation? How does that secure our future? How does it make us a regional leader? How does that help us having a respected history? And working with a fish biologist, it might mean that Ngarrindjeri work together to share knowledge, to actually be part of the employment opportunities in that space. Younger people learn from elders. Younger people are out there getting inspired to maybe be part of education and research. So there's a spin-off effect, and that's been built into this engagement strategy that this particular group of people have been developing in South Australia based on water, based on lands and waters. Some of the key strategies that Ngarrindjeri have developed in their engagement framework, looking at them, thinking about them. Contract law agreements has been critical. So because the legislation in South Australia doesn't support Indigenous interests very well, native title doesn't function very well in the space, heritage doesn't work well, there's no land rights in this region, Ngarrindjeri went down the track of contract law agreements to set the relationships. The idea of good governance and having a peak body and building that good governance which looks after lands and waters and people, economic development being seen as a core part of that, and that Ngarrindjeri don't see economic development as separate from looking after what might be seen as environment. Cultural change in regional management. one of the key things that Ngarrindjeri have found in engagement strategies is that the majority of policies and plans and practices that exist in their region are fundamentally developed in the interests of white people, I guess. They've been developed with a view that that space is colonised and that Ngarrindjeri really no longer exists in the space. So whenever you engage with a policy or a plan in this region, a lot of them have Ngarrindjeri totally missing from them. And a lot of the actual objectives that have been set don't incorporate Ngarrindjeri objectives. So if you've got a business plan for the local NRM board, how does it interact with the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority's plan and objectives? How do they reflect each other? And if you're interested in keeping the lands and waters healthy as an NRM board, how are you supporting the health of the Ngarrindjeri as the first people who are the lands and waters, who actually will give their lives to look after those lands and waters? They're going to make that place healthy. They're going to be great partners in the space. And that's one of the things that's starting to happen in that area. The philosophy of Rui Rua, the recognition that people are country, and partnerships. Ngarrindjeri have really seen it's critical to partner up at all sorts of levels, to do research, to be researchers, to work internationally, and to look for all sorts of opportunities to bring resources into their region. And the kind of projects and engagements that Ngarrindjeri look for are healing kind of programs and healthy flows. Projects, engagements that change the colonising relationship between Ngarrindjeri and the state. Projects that build Ngarrindjeri capacity to care for country, lands and waters, so they invest in the Ngarrindjeri rather than outside consultants or other institutions. Projects, engagements that respect Ngarrindjeri knowledge, law, tradition and expertise. And projects and engagements that bring energy into Ngarrindjeri lives, programs and plans. So one of the key things for Ngarrindjeri is that there's not a lot of people to go around. There's a number of people with skills, but not a lot of them. A lot of leaders. Daryl, a professor, he's a dean of a university. He'd love to be here, but he's doing something else. He works in other spaces. He's a member of the United League of Indigenous Nations. He does a whole range of roles. Projects need to be developed so that Ngarrindjeri or other Indigenous groups can engage in those projects without draining their resources. So how do you support the leadership, the young people to be engaged without taking them away from other things that they need to do? So being aware of where Indigenous communities and nations are heading is really critical. Now the Murray Futures program, and I can see a few people in this room who were part of this process of developing this project. This was jointly developed with non-Indigenous people, but Indigenous leaders said to the state government and the federal government, we have to be part of the Murray Futures recovery plan. When it was being developed initially, there was no real space for Indigenous people to be involved, other than to be consulted maybe at the end of the day. And what the strategy that Ngarrindjeri developed was to look at getting funding to facilitate partnerships, protect that unique relationship, enable Ngarrindjeri to have a major role in the region and build capacity. And that work's been going on since 2009 up to the present. Has fundamentally been around building capacity and processes and strategies for engagement, which hasn't really been described in any coherent way up to this point. There's publications here, there's publications there, there's little bits here and little bits there. The Goita projects allowed us to try to actually describe the overall engagement program that's been developing in this region. And they're built around KMY agreements. Ngarrindjeri have developed a sea country plan, Yalawarui plan. There's a monthly meeting with all of government departments who are involved in lands and waters work in the region called the KMY Task Force. Researchers come to that table as well and bring their projects. Ngarrindjeri have a Yalawarui program which looks after the lands and waters, so there are people employed in developing capacity. There are joint working groups underneath statements of commitment, so we have a research and monitoring working group in that region. So Ngarrindjeri have established that with Duna and with the Murray-Darling Basin Commission involvement through the Living Murray program. And every project that comes onto the Ngarrindjeri country goes through the research and monitoring working group to see whether there are ways that those projects can either be more beneficial to Ngarrindjeri, how they might impact either adversely or positively in the region, and to look at possibilities for maybe training and employment. There's also a revegetation working group, and there's working groups with local NRM boards and councils in similar forms, all dealing with issues to do with water and NRM planning. We're close, and I say we, the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority, are close to signing a water planning statement of commitment with the state around the Murray-Darling Basin region, which puts together a framework of how to engage and what to do with Ngarrindjeri and others on the river in terms of water planning, Murray-Darling Basin planning, local water allocation plans and others. There's also a cultural knowledge agreement being signed with the state. So what Ngarrindjeri said after Hindmarsh Island was, the elders said, we told people some of our cultural knowledge. We told a female anthropologist who promised to protect that knowledge from men and from public exposure. That became public knowledge, was seen by men, was desecrated. We don't feel safe talking about our knowledge to white people. You know, we've had terrible experiences in that space. How are we going to sit down and help to develop a new plan for the region which actually incorporates our knowledge but feels safe in that space? So one of the key things Ngarrindjeri have developed as a part of this engagement framework is cultural knowledge agreements, where anyone who's engaging, whether it be through the Murray Futures Project, universities, recognise that Ngarrindjeri people's cultural knowledge is their knowledge and not to be used anywhere else. It will be shared in that context where needed, but it won't be published and taken anywhere else, and it will be respected as such. It's a pretty strong sort of agreement to get the state, for instance, to start taking seriously, because that says that Indigenous people have a realm that's their own, that's no one else's business, and needs to be respected. But once that's actually recognised, then there's an opportunity to work together to do things that are actually creative and interesting. And you know, we're getting close to some pretty interesting things jointly with scientists and others, I think, in that region. Coorong National Park's potentially going to be co-managed and handed back in the not too distant future, where a lot of these kinds of strategies are going to be developed. And I think one of the key things that we tried to make clear in this paper too was that this engagement framework that's been Indigenous-led but then developed in partnership with government and local councils has come out of water and water issues, the meeting of the waters, but it's been around the development of Indigenous capacity to look after their lands and waters in the form of regional governance, regional authorities. Now the state government's picked up that idea and they're introducing the idea of regional authorities across the state, and there are now 4 pilot areas based on the kinds of models developed in this area. So out of natural resource management, water management, has come an innovation in Indigenous affairs and Indigenous engagement. And I think that message has been missed to some extent. It needs to be picked up, exactly where this stuff's come from, where's it going, and what it means. And it means in a way that, another thing Ngarrindjeri did, they said, look, working with Aboriginal heritage doesn't work. The department that was managing Aboriginal heritage had an act that was problematic, had a set of ways of thinking about Aboriginal people that were old-fashioned and limited. And so Ngarrindjeri actually said, we'd rather work with the Natural Resource Management area because they don't have a hard and fast view of who the hell we are. They don't want to study us and capture us, and they just want to work with us. That was the kind of thinking that a lot of the leadership I was working with were thinking. And in a lot of ways, that's been a productive model. There's been better opportunities to work together, to look after the lands and waters, which are a cultural issue, but they're not an archaeological site. They're not a scarred tree. They're not a thing you can put a line around and freeze in time from the past that's left behind by colonisation. It's an ongoing part of things. Just here show a project that Ngarrindjeri are involved in around this nation building that's looking at these innovations coming out of natural resource management. Ngarrindjeri partnered up with universities internationally, worked with Cambridge University, Harvard University on projects, bring in resources from all over the place and starting to work with other First Nations in Australia and overseas in this sort of work. So there's a lot of ideas and research coming in from these spaces. So when you're thinking about an engagement framework with Indigenous people, don't think of Indigenous people, I suppose, just as a local group who need to be engaged with. Those Indigenous people are probably researchers, travellers, scholars. They're engaged in partnerships all over the place, and they probably have a pretty interesting set of ideas about how they want to be engaged with and need to be part of the development of the actual model of engagement at the very baseline. Ngarrindjeri were, just two things to finish here. Ngarrindjeri were inspired by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon in 2005 and have been working with them and visiting that First Nation for a while, and also signed up to a treaty with other First Nations in 2007. So the people Ngarrindjeri partnered up with a stretch across Canada, US and New Zealand, and include those Maori people who've been working on cultural health indexes around, say, Waikato River and others. So there's a lot of work going on in the Indigenous community around these sorts of issues. So just finish up there, I think. I'll leave up on the board. Sorry, I wasn't going to use that. I'll leave that statement up there because that was the sort of question that leaders ask when they sit down to talk to non-Indigenous people about engaging.
Thank you, Steve.